Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.
In this podcast, we'll take a look at China-Russia relations and how recent developments, including Russia's war on Ukraine and a shared antagonism with the West, are increasing the need for closer ties between Moscow and Beijing. Want to know more? Stay with us.
Russia and China share a long and complicated history, with periods of cooperation alternating with tensions over their extensive shared border, communist doctrine, or most recently, COVID-19 responses.
Although they're not formal treaty allies, meaning they aren't bound to come to the other's defense, they call each other strategic partners and have strengthened ties since 2012 when Xi Jinping climbed to the top of the country's political system.
Since then, Russian and Chinese official rhetoric has portrayed their relation as being at their best point in history, cooperating on all issues including international affairs, military and technological development, driven in part by their common antagonism with the West, which both countries consider a rising threat to their regimes.
At a meeting in February 2022, just hours before the start of the Beijing Winter Olympics and only a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin said their partnership has no limits and vowed to deepen cooperation on various fronts, although it remains unclear whether Putin had informed his friend of his intentions to invade Ukraine.
But rhetorics don't always match reality.
No, they don't, and their relationship has seen major shifts since 1992. At the outset, China's population was greater than Russia's and the two countries had very similar economic power. But nowadays, thanks to China's explosive growth over the past 30 years and the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine, China's economy is about 10 times the size of Russia's.
Bilateral trade relations also appear less impressive than the joint statement of February 2022 would have the world believe.
In 2019, just before the pandemic struck, a quarter of Russia's exports went to China, making it Russia's top trading partner, while only 2% of China's exports went to Russia. And while Russia's dependency on exports to China has increased considerably, trade with Russia continues to be quite insignificant to China, even if exports of raw materials, food, and the transfer of Russian military technology are vital for the Asian giant.
In strategic terms, the increase in China's reliance on oil and gas imports from Russia will reduce its dependency on energy imports from the Middle East. Here's Ulrich Jochheim from the European Parliamentary Research Service.
Indeed, China's oil and gas imports are primarily delivered via sea lanes. 80% of China's oil imports, for example, pass through the Strait of Malacca, close to Singapore, a choke point which China might not be able to control in case of a serious international crisis.
But many foreign policy analysts say Russia's invasion of Ukraine could be a turning point in the relationship.
In their 2022 joint statement on serious international security challenges, Russia and China voiced their opposition to NATO enlargement, and China backed Russia's proposals to create long-term legally binding security guarantees in Europe. But there was no mention of either Ukraine or the South China Sea.
1 year later, in the joint statement that follows Xi's visit to Moscow, there's still no mention of Ukraine. And more interestingly, the former no-limits friendship has disappeared from the text.
Truth is, since the outbreak of Russia's war on Ukraine, China has refrained from taking a clear stance on the conflict, performing a balancing act to try to reconcile its important partnership with Russia with its defense of territorial integrity, which it sees as essential to achieve the reunification with Taiwan.
It has refused to condemn the armed aggression against Ukraine, and eager to become the international partner that brings the two sides to the negotiating table, it's come up with its own plan for a political settlement of the crisis.
The EU and the US have been appealing to the Chinese leader not only to use his influence on Putin to stop this brutal war, but also to engage with President Zelensky, which he finally did in April this year.
But how much of an honest broker in this conflict Xi can be remains doubtful. We spoke with Jakub Jakubowski, Deputy Director and Head of the China Department at the Center for Eastern Studies.
I believe China is not an honest broker when it comes to solving the war in Ukraine. It has very limited contacts with Kiev. It is visibly leaning towards Russia strategically and diplomatically. So I think it's China is using the peace process as mostly a PR exercise aimed at presenting itself as a responsible player, but also trying to find a coalition for a quick ceasefire within the whole Western alliance system.
In the meantime, G7 leaders meeting in Japan in May this year openly supported President Zelensky's peace formula in line with the UN resolution from February 2023. So, what can we conclude?
Well, it's clear that China is taking a much more active role on Ukraine than it did at the beginning of the conflict in March 2022. But Xi will need to weigh up whether its strategic alliance with Russia is worth the cost of this war and the impact on its own priorities and strategic interests.
Some experts believe China does not want the West to come out of this conflict much stronger, as this would very likely have further repercussions on the West's stance on Taiwan.
From the Chinese point of view, brokering a peace deal could allow China to promote an outcome that would best secure its political and economic interests and rebuild its international reputation. We asked Jakub Jakubowski for his take on the future of China-Russia relations.
I think the fundamentals of the China-Russia relationship are staying intact. Strategic synergy when it comes to countering the US-led alliance systems, and also certain ideological fondness between Beijing and Moscow. That being said, the relationship is quickly evolving as Russia is weakening and also becoming increasingly internally unstable. This will make China, on one hand, trying to use this advantage they have over Moscow, but at the same time trying to stabilize a Russian regime in order not to lose this particular partner.
What's clear is that how China-Russia relations develop will have major consequences for the international order.
Want to know more? Check out Ulrich Jochheim's full policy brief on the EPRS website or in our app.
This is a European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.
Thanks for listening.